Okay, hello. What I'm doing today is recording a video, so you've got it on hand for you. See, I'm in my lovely office with my lovely fake chalkboard behind me. This is about your first midterm exam for Intro to Philosophy. So, first a note about these questions. I'm not trying to fool you, but I've beefed up these questions somewhat, and they do actually require you to do two or three things with the idea or the passage of text that I isolate. I don't think I really isolated a specific passage of text for any of these questions, but I leave myself the ability to. I'm not trying to trick you with these questions, but you know from your reading that the material itself is quite tricky. So, what you should first do before you answer any of these questions is read them over carefully, craft your sort of responses, isolate, try and figure out what I'm asking you to do, because I'm asking you to do a few things with each. Generally, if there's a problem with these questions, it's student responses to these questions. That is, it's because the student didn't answer them completely. I have astounding faith in your ability to acquit yourself to this material. It's just a matter of you've got to do it all, right? So that's what is going on with these questions. So today, what I'm doing is going over these questions so you know what I'm asking you. And if you have any questions, email office hours. I'm there. I'm bored. I'm sitting around. So please come talk to me about philosophy. I didn't get into this career because I don't like to talk about it. So, yeah, here's the note about use all of the intellectual resources at your disposal. Well, you know, I actually engage with a lot of these. I'm an editor on Wikipedia, right? I'm very aware of Spark Notes and Grade and Saver and all of these other resources that are out there to get you through your Intro to Philosophy class, and some of it's quite good. And like I say, I contribute to some of it. In fact, right? These videos are part of that as well. But if you're using something that's not your example, not your explanation, not your block of text, you have to tell me, right? That's all. Otherwise, you're pretending like this is your idea and it's in fact not your idea, right? And the first hunk of this exam actually focuses on sort of a notion of intellectual integrity, right? So that's what we're trying to foster in you. With regard to specific reference styles, Jimmy can crack all the corn he likes. I still won't care. I don't care if you're MLA, in text, footnote, Chicago style, that sort of thing. I'm familiar with all of them, and just pick one and be consistent with it. I care that you reference. I don't care how you reference. If you're using additional intellectual resources. Of course, everything that I've given you in class and these two books and the supplements that I've posted to Moodle should be sufficient for you to answer all of these questions. Right? So you don't need, these are not research papers that you're writing me. They are just responses to the questions that emerge from your understanding out of the class. And then there's this other clause, but when you submit your responses to the questions below, your responses should reflect an individual effort and be in your own words. Well, I've had problems in the past with two people collaborating on their response to the exam and submitting one document, the same for the both two students kind of thing. That's not acceptable because I don't know who wrote what, and the registrar's office wants me to submit a grade for you, not your group, right? So I need an original academic work of art from each of you with regard to these. So please refer to the course syllabus and the policy on plagiarism to ensure that your responses comply with academic integrity standards. That's on the course syllabus. It's posted to Moodle. You've all got access to it. And there's one thing that's also in a footnote after the footnote telling you where I got the policy on plagiarism from. That's your student handbook. The additional footnote refers you to the SiteWrite program through the library, which is an online program. I've taken it. It's awesome. It tells you how, when, and under what circumstances you have to reference. It was a good primer for me because it's been like a good 20 years since I've looked at APA, for example. So it's up to date and complies with the most recent style guide. Unless you're using it all the time, you don't actually know what the heck is going on. So I advise to do that. Also recall that these are longer answer questions and require a minimum of 2 paragraphs response each. That's because I was getting like 3 sentence responses to these questions for 5% of your final grade. That's not sufficient. So there's a minimum sufficiency level that I'm looking for. Note that I haven't put a maximum response on there because, well, I don't know how you write yet. I'm just getting to know you guys. So for some people, it's especially with this Socrates and Plato material, it's presented to you in a dialogue, in a narrative, in a situation, right? So some people become alliterative and spend a lot of time setting up the narrative and the situation in which the conversation is going on, which is great. It's good for context. It shows me that you know what the heck you're talking about, and to some extent or another, it's important in these dialogues, but that paragraph that you use to set up the narrative doesn't do anything to address necessarily the nuts and bolts of these questions. So it's a matter of reading the questions and answering them completely. Right? Like I say, if there is a problem from students' responses, it's usually either in terms of the sufficiency or the completeness of their responses. Right? So 5 points each. Yes, I give half points for your responses. It's not pass fail on these questions. So you might get a 3.5, you might get a 4.5, that sort of thing. So they're out of 5 points each for a total of 30 points, and this exam is worth 30% of your final exam. Right? So that'll give you a sense of how much weight each of these questions have, and that'll make math nice and easy for both you to figure out where you stand in the course and me to compile your grades at the end of the course. So that's how that works. First question. So there are 3 on Socrates, 3 on Plato. This is pretty standard. All of your exams are kind of going to be this way. I leave myself the ability to ask you comparative questions. But I can tell you, just I tend not to. Right? I ask you to acquaint yourself with the material at hand. Right? So, first question from Socrates reads: Socrates argues that we should have a deep sort of reference for the notion of truth, though maintains that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. That's page 27 of your 5 dialogues. That'll give you an indication of where the relevant passage for answering this question might come, 27 and before. Right? Simply put, we can know nothing. Present an account of this position, which is Socrates giving an account of the nature of his wisdom, right, in your own words. So, again, you shouldn't be referencing or quoting or anything along those lines. You can, but only generally a reference or a quote is to provide evidence for an analysis that you then provide. Right? That's what quotations are for, right, or references. So you're presenting an account of this. So why is Socrates the wisest man in Athens? In the absence of knowledge of the truth, how does Socrates develop a moral position from this reverence? Right? So I'm asking you to follow the inference from his epistemology, the nature of his wisdom, his theory of knowledge, to his ethics, which emerges directly from it. I've referred to this position as intellectual integrity, or just generally, it's how does not Socrates manage to make a positive moral claim, even though he's made a negative claim about the possibility of knowledge. Right? This is different from what the sophists did. Right? So how does Socrates, so give me an account of his epistemology, give me an account of his ethics, and address the inference between them. And then at the end of this, I ask you to become critical. Is this position, by your arguments, justifiable? If you say yes, maybe buttress it against a counter-argument. Right? If you say no, issue a counter-argument. So that's more or less what I'm asking you to do. So, basically, I'm asking you to engage with the history of Western philosophy in this specific example, this specific position, and dispose yourself to it critically, precisely the way that Socrates would claim that we have to do this as his moral position, right? So, that's the first question. Right? So you're presenting the argument in your own words. You're following the inference from his epistemology to his ethics, and accounting for his ethics, and then you're critiquing the position. Right? So that's three things you're doing, more or less. Second question: Socrates discusses the social and political purpose of his position by comparing himself to the gadfly. Present and discuss this argument in your own words. So basically, what I'm asking you to do there is unpack a metaphor. Socrates is like a gadfly. Athens is like a sluggish but noble horse. So unpack that metaphor. Right? Just saying Socrates is the gadfly in Athens is the horse isn't sufficient. In what respect is Socrates like a gadfly? What are his behaviors that are gadfly-like? And in what sense is Athens like this noble horse? So unpack the metaphor. Second part of the question: why would Socrates find this element of moral reasoning absolutely essential for a functioning democracy? Now, we've had several conversations about how basically Jefferson grabbed this passage from Socrates and developed a position that has enshrined a certain kind of right, in the context of American democracy and just about any democracy in the world that is worth the name is going to enshrine these same rights for specific reasons. So, in what sense does a democracy require this critical moral reasoning from its citizens? Right? In addition to the blunt act of voting, is Socrates requiring from us? And then finally, I ask you, what political rights or protections does this argument serve to reinforce in our own democratic societies? I've given you lots of examples there, um, but frankly, in past semesters, I've had examples of political rights or protections that relate to this argument that I hadn't thought of. So if you can think of any, and present an account of why these rights or protections are connected to this argument, that'd be really cool. So, three things you're doing: unpack the metaphor, situate the metaphor in the context of Socrates' critique of democracy, and then give me an account of rights or protections that relate to this argument in our own societies. So, bing, bang, boom. Three things. Right? Um, then three, in the Credo, while considering escape, Socrates claims that the justice of the plan is the only valid consideration, page 51 of your 5 dialogues, pertaining to their final decision to act. To examine the justice of the matter, Socrates engages in a hypothetical conversation with the laws of Athens, in which he presents two extremely important and related notions: the social contract and tacit consent. Discuss these notions in your own words, drawing the distinction between them. So define social contract, define tacit consent, and distinguish between them. That's stage one. Two, how does Socrates draw on these notions to call moral question to the escape plan presented by Plato? Well, I've given you an indication in the setup for this question that the justice of the matter is the only valid consideration. So, Socrates' theory of justice is going to be handy for acquainting yourself with how this argument fits into the larger argument in the Credo. Right? So remember, Socrates' theory of justice is we should always do the good. We should never return evil for evil. Why? Because we should always do the good. And when we make an agreement, should we welch on it? No, because we should always do the good. Well, social contract is sort of like an agreement, right? It's a contract, right? And tacit consent is sort of the manner in which Socrates has agreed to the agreement by the terms set out by the agreement. right? So basically, I'm asking you to acquaint yourself and acquit yourself to situating these notions in the larger argument there, right? So that's what you're up to. Then, on to Plato. There are three questions here. The first one reads, Plato in the Phaedrus argues that the right sort of love, it's Plato, so it's Platonic love, can bring us closer to the perfect truth of the forms. Present an overview, this is the first thing that you're doing, of Plato's theory of the forms, his metaphysics, and his theory of recollection, his epistemology. So basically, the forms are, this is how they work, this is what sort of things they are, and how do we know them? Well, here's Plato's theory of recollection. All right? So more or less, this is just exegesis, right, that you're doing. You're explaining these two related notions in Plato's philosophy. All right? Second part, discuss how this argument presents love as a beneficial sort of madness. That is, what's special about love in the context of Plato's metaphysics and epistemology. He argues that the right sort of love, Platonic love, and actually, I'll give you an interesting page reference because there's an important notion there. 39 if memory serves. Hey, score one for memory. Page 39 is where the key notion that allows the connection between Platonic love and Plato's metaphysics and epistemology to occur. All right. So basically, I'm asking how the right sort of love can bring us closer to a knowledge of the forms. All right. So that is question number 4. So the first thing you do is present an account of the metaphysics and epistemology, and then what does this have to do with love? Same way I presented it in class, basically. All right. Question number 5, the second one for Plato, reads, Plato, through his discussion of the constitution of the soul, draws a distinction between the effects of an erotic relationship and those of Platonic love. So, basically, the first thing that I want you to do is account for Plato's, presentation of the constitution of the soul. This is his metaphor of the chariot driver and the team of winged horses. I gave you that pie chart in class. This is how rational we are. This is self-control, and here's desire, kind of thing. Right? So that's the first part of the question. Introduce a description of the constitution of the soul offered by Plato. 27, where he does that. Why don't I get your reference? This will be fun. Nope. It is 31. 31. That's where it is. Don't score one for memory. All right. So, constitution of the soul. And part 2, discuss the effects of each of these sorts of love relationship discussed in the Phaedrus. Note that there are 3 of them. The non-love relationship, which comes up in the first 2 speeches. It's presented as sort of a dispassionate friends with benefits kind of situation. All right. The erotic love kind of relationship, wherein the soul goes all crazy because Eros is pretty powerful. And then the Platonic relationship, which Plato talks about in terms of bringing harmony to the soul. How the heck does that work? So, what I want you to do is account for each of these 3 kinds of relationship in your description of how the soul is affected by love in each. Right? And then finally, question number 6, Plato with Platonic love. It's his form of love, so it's going to be, introduces a sort of love that would actually be beneficial in Socrates' second speech in the Phaedrus. So that's what we're talking about. However, Plato himself argues that this sort of love is really, really hard to achieve. Given this, would the non-love relationship discussed in the first 2 speeches, given the overpowering tendencies of Eros, be a safer alternative for most of us? Discuss this issue critically, presenting arguments to support your position which address all sides of the issue. Right? So basically, how did I end that class? The last class in which we were studying, going over this argument, Plato's position is we should be wary of eros, otherwise it could explode. I think my exact words, like an erotic hand grenade in your pants, or something along those lines. Plato himself admits that he's playing with fire, right here. Right? It's like, playing with explosives. Right, this kind of love. That's why the erotic relationship in the first two speeches was so heavily criticized, because we lose our minds over it. Right? The first two speeches presented the non-love relationship as an alternative. We critique them in class somewhat, but nonetheless, the non-love relationship is presented in the first two speeches as a viable and preferable alternative to eros. Plato's made a third argument about how eros can be harnessed and directed towards some things beneficial. But for most of us, and Plato's an unabashed elitist, uh, we're going to try and bring that harmony to our souls, but we're going to mess up. And eros is going to get the better of us. And we're going to do all of these things that are nasty and spiteful and jealous and hurtful and detrimental to the beloved. And then eventually our passion will die down and we'll be chased by the beloved, who now becomes the pursuer, trying to demand of us all of those things we said we'd do when we were drunk with love in the first place and that sort of thing. So really, what I'm asking you to do is, in light of Socrates' second speech, that is the third speech in this dialogue where he argues for Platonic love, is I'm asking you to assess Platonic love as presented by Plato in light of the probability of failure to achieve it. And ask yourself if the first two arguments presented for non-love still stand in light of what Plato has argued in this final speech that we looked at. Right? So this is the question in Plato where you become very critical of his account of Platonic love. Maybe you think it's going to be snazzy and great and want to argue for it. So what you have to do is make a case for for how the attempt to achieve Platonic love is worth it in light of the potential for all of these detrimental effects. Or if you want to say that Platonic love is a pipe dream, and in fact, if we look at, for example, all of the domestic sort of murder kind of statistics and all of the domestic violence that goes on in our own society, that are really this kind of love, the effects that attempting to achieve it have are so detrimental that, in fact, Lysias and Socrates in his first speech were right. Right? That might be a good way to argue against Platonic love. Right? So you've got all of the resources there. I'm asking you to take a position and argue it in terms of what you've learned from Plato. So that's your exam. Nice, huh? So it's due February 7th by 11:55 p.m., 5 minutes to midnight. That's a Friday. I'm not expecting you to stay up till midnight working on this. What I'm expecting you to do is plan your time and get it done at a reasonable hour so you can enjoy your Friday. But if you procrastinate, you've got until 11:55 p.m. I would suggest that you somehow print or save a version of these questions for your records, because as of 11:55 on the Friday the 7th, this will just disappear from your perspective at Moodle. It'll just go away. That's because if you're submitting late, I tend to think that requires a conversation with me about why and whether or not I'm going to accept it. Right? So it disappears, right, at the due date and time. Right? So make sure you've submitted your responses by then, or contact me, and if you've got like some sort of valid medical or familial kind of excuse, I'll work with you for an extension. I want you to submit in .doc, .docx, PDF, or .txt format. It's a word of caution. If you're submitting using Open Freely, make sure the whole document is there because I've had a lot of issues with these documents not showing up completely as a result of using Open Freely, which is buggy as all heck because it's freeware. You know, it's your responsibility to get me your document on time and completely. I'm not going to go chasing after you. Well, because it's your responsibility. There are a lot of you, frankly, and I don't have the time at my disposal to really chase you for this. So get it to me. If I don't have it, and I haven't granted an extension, it's like it doesn't exist, right? So anyhow, that's your exam. If you have any questions whatsoever, I'm on campus Wednesday and Friday doing office hours. Monday as well, of course, and I will do my best to answer any sort of questions that you have. The entirety of next week is slotted for review. It's if you have any questions, come armed with them in class. Friday's class is last call. Basically on Friday, I will come in, stand there, and say, "Do you have any questions?" And I'll stand there answering them until you're done, right? And then we can go about it, about our day. You've got the rest of the day on Friday to make use of what I've said. And next week, we start Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Right? So it's a cool argument. I quite like it. We will probably get through books 1 and 2 next week. It goes pretty quickly. It's a great argument. I quite like it. And I choose the Hackett translation for good reasons, I think. So there are other versions of the Nicomachean Ethics out there. For example, the Pocket Aristotle has a version of it. I don't like the translation as well, and this has notes that are handy. So anyhow, that's what we're dealing with. Books 1, 2, and 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics next week. And good luck with this. I've given you lots in the way of resources, so you should be in pretty good shape to write these exams. And these questions are really kind of the only questions that there could be. Right? It's interesting how that happens. So anyhow, have good days, one for each of you, and let me know if you need anything. Thanks.